It was just another day in Professor Alden's political science class at Harvard University, or so everyone thought. The room buzzed with the usual chatter of students settling into their seats, notebooks open, pens ready. But today felt different somehow. There was an edge in the air, a tension that no one could quite put their finger on. Professor Alden walked in, his sharp suit perfectly pressed, his tie knot immaculate. He carried himself like a man who owned the world, and maybe he did. Known for his fiery lectures and unapologetic opinions, Alden wasn't afraid to ruffle feathers. And this particular lecture, it promised to be explosive. "Good morning, class," he began, his voice cutting through the hum of conversation like a knife. "Today, we're going to talk about leadership styles. Specifically, we'll analyze one of the most controversial figures in modern history, Donald Trump." A murmur rippled through the room. Some students leaned forward eagerly, others exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone knew where this was headed. Professor Alden had made no secret of his disdain for the former president. His lectures often turned into passionate tirades against anything remotely connected to Trump's administration. As expected, Alden launched into a scathing critique. "Donald Trump represents everything wrong with politics today," he declared, pacing back and forth as if addressing a courtroom jury. His policies were reckless, his behavior undignified, and his rhetoric divisive. How anyone ever took him seriously is beyond me. The classroom fell silent except for the occasional nod from those who agreed with the professor. But then, something unexpected happened. Karoline Leavitt raised her hand. At first glance, Karoline seemed like any other student, quiet, observant, blending into the crowd. She rarely spoke up in class, preferring instead to listen and absorb. Yet there was something about her today, a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Yes, Miss Leavitt?" Professor Alden asked, pausing mid-step. "I have a question," she said softly, but firmly, her voice carrying across the room. "Do you think it's fair to dismiss someone entirely based on their flaws? Isn't it possible that even people with imperfections can achieve great things?" The room grew quieter than ever. Students turned to look at Karoline, surprised by her boldness. Professor Alden frowned slightly, clearly caught off guard. No one dared challenge him during these lectures. "That's a very naive perspective," he replied after a moment, his tone dismissive. "Greatness doesn't excuse incompetence or immorality. Donald Trump may have achieved some things, but his methods and character disqualify him from being considered a true leader." Karoline hesitated for a second, gathering her thoughts. Then she stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. Every eye in the room was on her now. "With all due respect, Professor," she began, her voice steady despite the pressure, "I don't believe greatness and morality always go hand in hand. History is full of leaders who accomplished incredible feats, while also making terrible mistakes. Should we ignore their achievements because they weren't perfect?" Her words hung in the air, challenging not just the professor but the entire class. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Even Professor Alden appeared stunned, his confident demeanor cracking ever so slightly. Finally he responded, "Miss Leavitt, your argument lacks depth. You're oversimplifying complex issues. Leadership requires both vision and integrity. Without either, failure is inevitable." Karoline nodded slowly, acknowledging his point. But she wasn't done yet. "What if I told you," she continued, her voice rising slightly, "that sometimes failure leads to growth, that mistakes teach us lessons we wouldn't learn otherwise? Maybe Donald Trump wasn't the ideal leader, but dismissing him outright ignores the impact he had on millions of people who believed in him." The room erupted in whispers. Students leaned toward each other, debating what Karoline had just said. Some nodded in agreement, others shook their heads in disbelief. Professor Alden stared at her, his expression unreadable. Before he could respond, Karoline added one final thought. "And isn't it our job as students not just to judge, but to understand, to see both sides of every story?" The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Alden stood frozen for a moment, his usual composure replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Students held their breath, waiting to see how he would respond to Karoline's bold challenge. Finally, the professor cleared his throat and adjusted his tie, regaining some semblance of control. "Miss Leavitt," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "you make an interesting point. But let me ask you this. If we accept flawed leaders simply because they inspire passion, where do we draw the line? At what point does inspiration become dangerous?" Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she took a deep breath and replied, "I think the real question is whether we're willing to engage in honest conversations about leadership flaws and all. If we only focus on tearing people down, we miss opportunities to learn from them and from each other." Her response sent ripples through the classroom. Some students clapped softly, clearly impressed by her courage and clarity. Others exchanged skeptical glances, unsure if they agreed with her perspective. But one thing was certain: Karoline had shifted the tone of the lecture entirely. Professor Alden glanced around the room, taking in the reactions of his students. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, a small, almost reluctant smile. "Very well," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "You've given me something to think about, Miss Leavitt. Perhaps I've been too quick to dismiss certain viewpoints." The class erupted in murmurs of surprise. Many hadn't seen Professor Alden admit uncertainty before, let alone acknowledge the validity of an opposing opinion. For a teacher known for his unyielding stance, this was groundbreaking. But the biggest shock came next. Donald Trump himself might have something to say about this. The professor mused aloud, turning back to the whiteboard. "In fact, I believe he once said, 'Don't let anyone tell you who you are.' Miss Leavitt, it seems you've taken that advice to heart." The room exploded into laughter, followed by applause. Even Karoline couldn't help but smile, though her cheeks flushed red with embarrassment. She sat back down, feeling a mix of relief and pride wash over her. As the lecture continued, Professor Alden surprised everyone by shifting gears. He began discussing leadership through a broader lens, exploring both strengths and weaknesses of various historical figures, not just Donald Trump, but also Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, and even Napoleon Bonaparte. His approach became less judgmental and more analytical, encouraging students to form their own opinions rather than blindly accepting his views. By the end of the class, the atmosphere had completely transformed. What started as a heated debate turned into a thought-provoking discussion that left everyone buzzing with excitement. As students packed up their things and filed out of the classroom, many stopped to thank Karoline for speaking up. "You were amazing," one girl whispered as she passed by. Another added, "I never thought I'd hear Professor Alden change his mind like that." Karoline shrugged modestly, though inside she felt a surge of confidence she hadn't experienced before. Standing up to someone as authoritative as Professor Alden wasn't easy, but it reminded her of an important truth: even the most powerful voices can be challenged, and sometimes changed. Later that evening, news of the incident spread quickly across campus. Word reached social media, where snippets of the lecture went viral. Videos of Karoline's exchange with Professor Alden garnered millions of views, sparking debates worldwide. People weighed in on both sides, praising her bravery while others criticized her for defending a polarizing figure. Meanwhile, Karoline tried to ignore the attention, focusing instead on her studies. But deep down, she knew her life had changed forever. That day in class, she proved to herself, and to everyone else, that standing up for what you believe in matters, no matter how intimidating the situation may seem. And as for Professor Alden, well, he found himself rethinking his teaching methods after that unforgettable lecture. From then on, he encouraged open dialogue and diverse perspectives, reminding his students that learning isn't about having all the answers, it's about asking the right questions. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Karoline. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, classmates, and even strangers congratulating her on her courage. Articles popped up online, analyzing her exchange with Professor Alden. Some hailed her as a symbol of free speech, while others accused her of defending controversial ideas without fully understanding their consequences. Despite the attention, Karoline remained grounded. she continued attending classes, participating in discussions, and working on assignments, determined not to let the spotlight distract her from her goals. Yet, she couldn't deny the ripple effect her actions had created. One evening, as she sat in the library studying for an upcoming exam, a familiar figure approached her table. It was Professor Alden, carrying a stack of books and looking unusually approachable. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice devoid of its usual edge. Karoline blinked in surprise, but nodded politely. "Sure, Professor." He set the books down and pulled out a chair, sitting across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, breaking the silence, he said, "I wanted to thank you for challenging me the other day. You forced me to reconsider some of my assumptions, and for that I'm grateful." Karoline stared at him, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "You're thanking me?" Alden chuckled softly. "Yes, believe it or not, good teachers are always learning too. And sometimes, the best lessons come from students like you." Touched by his words, Karoline smiled shyly. "Thank you, Professor. That means a lot." Their conversation flowed naturally after that, covering everything from leadership theories to current events. To Karoline's surprise, Alden listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, and offering insights that made her think differently about several topics. By the time they parted ways, she realized she had gained not just a mentor but also a friend. Back in the classroom, things had shifted subtly yet significantly. Gone were the one-sided lectures where Professor Alden dominated the discussion. Instead, he encouraged debates, inviting students to share their perspectives openly. He introduced new case studies, highlighting leaders from different backgrounds and eras, emphasizing the importance of context and nuance. During one such session, he posed a question that resonated deeply with the class. Is it possible to separate a leader's policies from their personal character, or are the two inseparable? The room buzzed with debate, opinions flying back and forth. Karoline watched silently, proud to see her peers engaging so passionately. In that moment, she understood the power of dialogue, to challenge, to inspire, and to grow. Months later, as graduation approached, Karoline reflected on her journey at Harvard. What began as a quiet student hesitant to speak up had transformed into someone confident enough to stand her ground, even against authority figures. And while she didn't agree with everyone, or expect them to agree with her, she learned the value of listening and understanding differing viewpoints. On her last day, she stopped by Professor Alden's office to say goodbye. He greeted her warmly, handing her a book titled Leadership in Turbulent Times. "For you," he said simply. "Keep questioning, keep growing." Karoline hugged the book to her chest, tears pricking her eyes. "Thank you, Professor, for everything." As she walked away, she felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. Standing up in that classroom wasn't just about defending Donald Trump, it was about standing up for herself, for her beliefs, and for the idea that no single perspective holds all the answers. And maybe, just maybe, she inspired others to do the same. The summer after graduation found Karoline reflecting on her journey, not just at Harvard but in life. She had always been a reserved person, content to observe the world, rather than actively participate in it. But that day, in Professor Alden's classroom changed everything for her. It wasn't just about standing up to a professor or defending a controversial figure. It was about discovering her own voice and learning how to use it responsibly. She landed an internship at a prestigious think tank, where she worked alongside some of the brightest minds in politics and economics. Her colleagues were impressed by her ability to analyze complex issues from multiple angles, a skill she credited to those intense debates in Professor Alden's class. They often joked that she could argue both sides of any issue convincingly, which made her invaluable during brainstorming sessions. One afternoon, as she pored over data for a new project, her supervisor stopped by her desk. "Karoline," he said, leaning casually against the edge, "I've been meaning to ask. You seem so calm and collected most of the time. What made you speak up like you did back in school?" Karoline paused, considering the question carefully. I guess I realized that staying silent doesn't change anything. If you believe in something strongly enough, you owe it to yourself and to others to say something. Her supervisor nodded thoughtfully. Well, we're lucky to have someone with your perspective here. Keep pushing boundaries, okay? That evening, as Karoline walked home through the bustling city streets, she thought about all the people who had inspired her along the way. Professor Alden, despite his initial skepticism, had taught her the importance of challenging assumptions. Her classmates, even those who disagreed with her, had shown her the power of respectful dialogue, and her family, especially her parents, had instilled in her the values of integrity and perseverance. But perhaps the biggest lesson came from within herself. Standing up in that classroom proved to her that she was capable of more than she ever imagined. It gave her the confidence to pursue opportunities she once thought out of reach, and to tackle challenges head-on. A year later, Karoline found herself back at Harvard, this time as a guest speaker at a student-led seminar on leadership and communication. Nervous yet excited, she stepped onto the stage, facing a sea of eager faces. Many recognized her from the viral video of her exchange with Professor Alden, and their applause filled the room. Thank you, she began, smiling warmly. It's great to be here today. Now I'm sure many of you know why I'm standing here. That day, in Professor Alden's class taught me something important. Leadership isn't just about having all the answers. Sometimes, it's about asking the right questions, and being brave enough to seek those answers, even when it's uncomfortable. She went on to share stories from her internship, highlighting moments when she faced resistance or doubt but pushed forward anyway. She encouraged the students to embrace their unique perspectives, and to engage in meaningful conversations, even or especially with those who disagree with them. Afterward, during the Q&A session, a young woman raised her hand. How do you deal with criticism? Not everyone agrees with your views, and sometimes it must get tough. Karoline nodded knowingly. You're absolutely right. Criticism is part of the package when you choose to speak up. But here's what I've learned. You can't control what others think of you, but you can control how you respond. Stay true to your values, listen openly, and remember that growth often comes from discomfort. The audience erupted in applause, and Karoline felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. This was exactly why she agreed to speak, to inspire others the way she had been inspired. As the years passed, Karoline continued to make waves in her field. She published articles, delivered keynote speeches, and collaborated with organizations focused on fostering open dialogue and critical thinking. Along the way, she stayed in touch with Professor Alden, who became one of her closest mentors. Their relationship evolved into a partnership of sorts, with both of them working together to promote balanced discussions in academia and beyond. Whenever someone asked her about that fateful day in class, she smiled and said simply, "It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about starting a conversation, one that continues to grow and evolve every day." And maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest legacy of all. As Karoline's career flourished, she often found herself reflecting on the ripple effects of that single moment in Professor Alden's classroom. What started as a quiet act of defiance grew into something far greater, a movement toward open dialogue, mutual respect and understanding. She realized that her story wasn't unique. Countless others had faced similar moments of truth, where they chose to either stay silent or speak up. One evening, while attending a gala for emerging leaders, Karoline met a young woman named Mia, who reminded her of herself years ago, quiet, observant, and unsure of her place in the world. During their conversation, Mia confessed her fear of speaking out, worried about backlash or rejection. Karoline listened intently, then shared her own experience. "I get it," she said gently. "It's scary to put yourself out there. But here's what I've learned. Every time you choose to speak up, you give permission to someone else to do the same. You never know whose life you might change or how." Mia nodded thoughtfully, her eyes lighting up with newfound determination. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means a lot. Moments like these reinforced Karoline's belief in the power of individual actions. A single word, a single gesture, could spark a chain reaction that touched lives in ways unimaginable. And though she didn't seek fame or recognition, she took pride in knowing she'd played a small part in encouraging others to find their voices. Years later, as Karoline sat in her office overlooking the city skyline, she received an unexpected package. Inside was a letter from Professor Alden, now retired, but still actively involved in educational reform. The note read, "Dear Karoline, I hope this message finds you well. As I reflect on my career, one moment stands out above all others, the day you stood up in my classroom and challenged me to see things differently. That exchange not only changed my teaching style, but also deepened my appreciation for the courage and conviction students bring to the table. Thank you for reminding me why I became a teacher in the first place. Keep inspiring others as you have inspired me. Your impact extends far beyond what you may realize. Sincerely, Professor Alden." Tears welled up in Karoline's eyes as she reread the letter. It wasn't just a testament to her growth, but a reminder of the interconnectedness of human experiences. Every action, no matter how small, had the potential to create waves of change. In the end, Karoline's story wasn't about being right or wrong, it was about embracing complexity, fostering dialogue, and standing firm in her beliefs, while remaining open to learning. Her journey proved that even the most ordinary moments could lead to extraordinary outcomes, provided you were willing to take the leap. And so, with a heart full of gratitude, and a mind brimming with ideas, Karoline pressed onward, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, the world was waiting, and she was more than ready to meet it head on. Thank you for sticking with me through this wild ride. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this.